While the world faces COVID-19, many industries have been challenged. The food industry has been no exception from that. Business owners have seen unprecedented drops in profit, and those hardships extend to farmers, truck drivers, restaurant service staff, and many more. Today, I will take you through what the outcome of this epidemic has been on the food industry and what steps can be taken to reshape our food supply to meet proper standards during a global pandemic. Important aspects of this process involve preparing protocol for things like food businesses and economics, prioritizing the safety of consumers and workers in the food industry, and maintaining proper transportation of food to all communities in need. The first step is to look at the initial result of the virus. Lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, and mandated business shutdowns caused a substantial drop-off of income for almost any food service. The entire month of late March and early April saw less than 40% transactions compared to last year. This shutdown almost destroyed the small business restaurant industry in weeks, with 1 in 6 permanently closing its doors within the first 6 months of the virus. This shockwave hit tourist attractions particularly hard, with New York among other large cities experiencing the harshest blows. In September, the New York State Restaurant Association found that 63% of restaurants felt that they were likely or somewhat likely to close by the end of the year without more financial relief. That was over 2 months ago, during which there has been no additional help, and just days ago, New York officials were calling for another restaurant shutdown following COVID rates that have never stopped increasing despite social distancing outdoors in the warmer months. The same graph dividing restaurants into quick service and full service tells a clearer picture. The effects on full-service restaurants were severe, as much of the reason that the restaurant and tourism industry thrives is based around the enjoyment of an in-person experience. These restaurants were not ready for a transition to COVID-safe dining, and while some made outdoor or spaced-out dining available, both of those options becomes less viable during the winter, and a lockdown enforcing even more limited indoor dining seems inevitable. Fast food and takeout has gotten by substantially better, reflected by Uber Eats and food delivery services being more successful than ever. This pandemic hit many of us as a shock. The abruptness that everything came to a halt was the most astonishing thing about it. No one had time to prepare, but those who just had to change to working from home had it much simpler than any farmer could have. The food industry, specifically with animal products and other perishables, is designed to work in a timely manner to get everything where it needs to be on time to be sold fresh. Not only were there difficulties getting stock transnationally shipped, in just weeks the demand for products dipped due to the decrease in transactions discussed previously. Perishable stock went to waste not only in restaurants, but also large corporations who had nowhere to send their newly made produce and dairy. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of milk had to be dumped and millions of pounds of produce was resorted to being buried for manure. Food shipped to airports sat for days as flights were canceled and travel restrictions held in place for far longer than many expected. The nature of farming and shipping food is that it cannot stop, and those continually going into work to keep a food supply stable for the rest of us are put at risk to keep that rhythm going. The COVID pandemic simply worsened the already devastating number of people facing hunger or food insecurity in America. Feeding America, a hunger relief organization, published data showing that the number of food insecure people would rise over 50 million in 2020, including 17 million children. This would mean that 1 in 6 people and 1 in 4 children in America will experience food insecurity this year due to worsened conditions caused by the COVID pandemic. It shows that Massachusetts will experience the largest relative increase in food insecurity this year, with child insecurity rates increasing by 163% in Norfolk County. Nationwide, both the virus and the hunger epidemic disproportionately affect Black communities. Black Americans were more likely to go unemployed or without full work due to COVID affecting their job. This leads to economic disparity in the household, and in 2020, 72% of the counties with the highest food insecurity rates were majority Black. Social distancing and public health messaging has been confusing this year. Despite that, much of the country wears masks and does their best to keep others safe. For workers in meat processing plants, that feels impossible. There is no social distance that is possible when you are either working on the slaughter line or in a processing assignment, says Paula Schelling, acting chairwoman for the Food Inspectors Union in the American Federation of Government Employees. Due to these troubles, COVID outbreaks became rampant in meat processing plants in early April, both in the United States and all across Europe. Smithfield Foods in South Dakota, a meat production plant responsible for 5% of the U.S. daily pork supply, closed down in April after 300 of 3,700 workers tested positive. When working in close lines and sharing locker rooms with changes of clothes, no safety is possible without limiting staff. In turn, meat prices rose in the spring enough for Trump to sign an executive order classifying meat processing as critical infrastructure during a pandemic. This received major pushback from unions concerned for the well-being of their lives. Meat plants have since implemented physical barriers between workers in many plants as a way to try and keep them as best distance as they can. The best response at this point to the pandemic should be to develop the ongoing interest in locally sourced foods through policy that gives help and benefits to these farmers, as well as to the grocers buying the products, which may be more expensive than food sourced out of the country. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations updated their nutrition priorities on March 27th following the pandemic to include plans for closure of schools, food waste due to several discrepancies, such as closure of markets and stalls, restriction of supply and manpower, and others. They also have several well-laid-out plans involving how to keep a community sustainable, but most importantly, safe. While we fight through the rough months ahead, any help negotiated by the government should hopefully be funneled directly to people and communities in need. Almost half of restaurant workers lost their jobs within 2 months of the pandemic and have largely been unemployed since. Most of the recovery made this summer may be lost in the winter, and there need to be preparations to keep these people afloat when this next wave hits. Looking at the same Feeding America study as previously, they show how food insecurity is most common in the rural South. Many of these southern communities house predominantly African American communities struggling without aid.